Afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, relatives, wherever you are on the Turtle's Back today. And thank you for joining our webinar today, Breaking Up with Bill C5, Canada Uncommitted. We have some really amazing panelists here today to discuss the context that we're operating under here in so-called Canada. And just want to thank everybody for taking the time to join and to our panelists as well. And a big thank you to communities of color operating in allyship for providing American Sign Language interpretation. Disability justice is climate justice. And so just a reminder to myself and our panelists to keep a nice leisurely pace for our interpreters. And we'll get started shortly with introductions. But we have a lot to get into today, and we know here in Canada, we've dealt with a major uproar in this sort of nationalist discourse in response to the Trump regime, tariff threats, and the previous talks of annexation, never 51. And following the federal election in April, that saw the naming of Prime Minister Carney to the federal level, we've since seen this legislation that allows for the fast tracking of extractive projects in the name of energy sovereignty and national security. In my home province of Ontario, Bill 5, or Protecting Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy, Bills 14 and 15 in so-called British Columbia, and most notably the federal Bill C5. And so this fast tracking of these projects means that Canada will be unable to meet its climate commitments, both at home and internationally, including the 30th Conference of the Parties, which is called the COP, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, where ICA has a delegation on the ground. One of my colleagues is calling into us live from Belém, Brazil. And so we're in a really interesting political situation, and we wanted to take some time today to discuss that. So I'm going to hand over to our panelists. We have Disa Crowchief, Taylor Galvin, and my colleagues Willow Prince and Jocelyn Drostrack. So I'm going to hand over to Taylor to allow you to introduce yourself, however you'd see fit, and a little bit about the work that you're doing and how you came to this. So off to you, Taylor.
Miigwech. I understand it might be a little difficult to translate. So buju anin ojo amashkode bejike dejnekaz na me do dem baskan da be wiza bing anishina be aki and dinji minongigajep and dinaway maganadug. I'm just introducing myself in our Anishinaabe Moin language. My name is Brown Buffalo. I'm a member of the Sturgeon clan from Broken Head Ojibwe Nation here in Treaty 1 in southern Manitoba. We are the southernmost community on the shores of Lake Winnipeg. I'm a graduate student at the University of Manitoba. I'm doing a master's degree that looks at storytelling and a thesis in the form of a documentary to protect sturgeon. On top of that, I'm one of the inaugural fellows in this First Nations Women Transforming Conservation Fellowship in partnership with Indigenous Leadership Initiative and the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada. And then on top of that, I do a lot of this type of work, a lot of advocacy and activism work. I've had the absolute honor of traveling the world advocating for Indigenous water rights, most recently at World Water Week in Sweden, and then for New York Climate Week. And so it's a privilege and an honor to be here with you today to share whatever I can with what, and I hope it opens up the door to a lot of really good dialogue. So miigwech, and I'd like to say miigwech to the fellow panelists. Some of you I actually know, and so I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taylor. And I'll hand over to Disa.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Okay, cool. Okay, nisonego it's binamaka. Hi, everyone. My name is Disa Crochief. I come from Siksika Nation, which is one of 4 tribes that make up the Blackfoot Confederacy, the other 3 being Piikani, Kainai, and Amska-Piikani, which is Browning, and it goes into the states. I am currently the community researcher for the University of Calgary, and within that role, um, they have really let me take the lead in innovating Indigenous and youth engagement and what I envision that role to be. So I have been able to put together a team of young people from across Blackfoot Confederacy. And we are known by the Blackfoot Youth Water Council. We have done some work over the last few years. We're still, I would say, pretty much new, but are getting out there. I just wanted the group to be a space that was inclusive, and so there is some members that are like recurring for different projects, but a lot of the members are people who come in and out regarding like certain projects and being able to support youth events and gatherings. Um, and I'm also the youth rep for the Siksika Water Advisory Panel. So we look over and just advise water-related issues within Siksika and the surrounding communities and across like Blackfoot Confederacy. The previous work I've done in the past is I co-founded the National Energy Summit called 7Gen. So I worked on it the first time in 2017 in Mexico, and it was brought to life in 2019. Since then, it has grown into a beautiful gathering that has been held multiple times and supported different people. Um, I take a very different approach when it comes to energy talk and water talk and policy talk. Um, I think that we weren't people that were colonized, and that's how we became better. And it was a necessary feat for us to have for that to happen. I think the important part of the work that I do is shift in perspectives and unlearning that and bringing pride back to young people. And something I go by is that youth are not the future. Youth are the present and are capable of contributing today. And the world is indigenous. It's the medicines, telling time, being able to turn numbers into flowers, the way we treat each other, the way we have a relationship with the environment around us those are just values that I have been instilled in as a Siksika woman. So I'm very, very happy to be here and honored to work with ICA, and I hope that we can connect more in the future. And I'm proud to learn from the panelists, and I hope that where everyone is right now, that you are in good spirits and have good energy and get something good from this. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Disa. I was getting a little fired up listening to you. So thank you for your words. And I'll pass over to Jocelyn.
Hi, Kanzanu Sosan, Hayenji, Takalama Uye, Kwanlin Ninje, Agunda Iche. My name is Jocelyn Jostrack. I'm a member of the Champagne and Ajax First Nation here in Whitehorse in the Yukon. And I am very honored to be the new interim executive director for Indigenous Climate Action. I think I'm on week 3 here, and it has been such an honor and a privilege to come into this very important and amazing work. I come from a background of science, of leadership, of really fighting for Indigenous rights and sovereignty. I'm very committed to youth, and I loved what you just said, Disa, that the youth are our present. The world is Indigenous, and that is the power of the path forward. Some of my most important work has been with Yukon First Nations youth in development of the Reconnection Vision, which is their pathway for change, which sees us being whole people and living in good relationship with our whole selves, with each other, and with the land. It's about healing and about working together. And I bring their philosophy into all of the spaces that I have the privilege to be a part of. I am also board chair of the David Suzuki Foundation, where we're really thinking hard upon David's brave and amazing words about the environmental movement, the climate movement. Is it in community, or how much more time do we spend really thinking about policy? And I think this conversation today will lend a lot for that. I have formerly been trustee of the Yukon First Nations School Board, which my tenure is up in about 5 days there, which was really important work. I really believe that education is one of our key pathways to change. And I formerly was also senior advisor to the Auditor General of Canada and reviewed audits around the critical minerals strategy and different avenues for resource development that just hit walls. And I look forward to exploring those with you as well. So Guinness Chish for this opportunity to share with these amazing panelists, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. For those who maybe didn't see, we published a blog announcing Jocelyn stepping in as our interim executive director at ICA, and you can check that out on our website. And last but certainly not least, I will hand over to Willow.
Thank you, Carol. Looks like we're already off to a really amazing start. I think we're in some really great company this afternoon. Hi, everybody. My name is Willow Prince. I am Dak Athene from Nak Asli Watan in the lands that we currently uncomfortably and non-consensually know as British Columbia, Canada. I'm currently living a few hours south on the lands of the Claytley Tene, or what is currently known as Prince George, BC in the Northern Interior. I'm working with Indigenous Climate Action as the campaign manager. And like Carol was saying at the start of this, I am actually very far away from where I'm from right now. I'm currently in Belém, Brazil, to attend the 30th Conference of Parties, the United Nations Climate Summit. It's my first COP, and I'm really excited to reflect on some of these experiences that I've had so far, and to talk a bit about like Canada's climate commitments and what I've observed here on the ground in Belém and what's going on back home. You know, most notably that our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is actually currently right now a few hours north of my home territories, getting ready to announce the next wave of major projects, these projects of national interest. Currently. And so I'm really excited to unpack a lot of that and really excited to learn with, to ruminate and resist with the fellow panelists here. I'll pass this back to Carol to get us started.
Thanks so much, Willow. And I realized in my excitedness that I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Kel Montour. I am Mohawk Wolf Clan of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, where I'm calling to you from. And I'm the education and training manager here at Indigenous Climate Action. So as you can tell, our panelists come from a wide breadth of experience and perspectives, and I think this is going to lend really well to our conversation. And as Willow mentioned, there's going to be an announcement, if it hasn't happened already, from Mark Carney about the next so-called nation building energy project in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, which is set to be a liquefied natural gas facility. There's an expected 4 energy and mining development projects to be announced over the and we've seen with Bill C5, it's I think to be called the One Canadian Economy Act. And so there's parts in there to reduce inter-province trade, as well as expediting national interest projects. So in this time of climate chaos, where it's been, I was reading recently that the 1.5 degrees Celsius commitment under the Paris Agreement is essentially. This time of climate chaos, we're seeing this push to extractive industry and fast tracking these projects under the guise of building national security. And so to our panelists, I'm going to pose our first question that I will get all of you to ask. And so how do colonial policies and legislation such as Bill C5, the One Canadian Economy Act, impact our rights as Indigenous people? And then how can we leverage those rights as they are upheld in international documents such as the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to push back against corporations and governments? And I'll direct this to Taylor.
Oh my gosh, I have to go first. Can you, I'm just trying to find the question again. If you can put it in the chat. I don't
Totally.
know if can somebody else go first right now? Okay, thanks.
No problem. And I'll hand over to Jocelyn and put that in the chat for everybody.
When you called on Taylor, I was like, oh, thank goodness I'm not first, but I can be first. So goodness cheesh, it's an important question. And it's the reality of Indigenous people. Colonial policies continuously confront our rights, our sovereignty, and our solutions. This is the thing, is that our rights, by really coming back into um, living true with the land, living true within community, we're coming back into a place of balance. But with these colonial policies that still view extractivism, like perpetual growth, as the pathway forward, it comes in direct conflict with our underlying and true values and natural laws of balance. Our long ago stories really speak to how going out of balance was one of the greatest wrongs. And so now, as we're really thinking about what does it mean for us to leverage our rights to confront these policies that are inherently flawed? And, I've been really reflecting a lot on my role with the Auditor General of Canada, where we reviewed the critical mineral strategy and the early implementation of that, where they produce plans. The federal government puts in a policy and then produces plans about how they want to achieve this policy. But within my role with the auditor, I read the same story over and over and over again, that there could be a gold star policy. But once it goes into the departments, and those departments are expected to work with others interdepartmentally, with First Nations people, with provinces, with municipalities, there is an inherent breakdown or stall in many of the projects that get stuck at MOU, that get stuck at roles and responsibilities. Like, these fundamental practices of how we work together are not operating within the federal government. And so with that, they cut things. They cut things that are difficult. And so in the critical minerals strategy, we saw that they had 5 goals. And the 2 things that were cut were the environmental protection aspects, looking a lot at wetlands and what's important, and were relationships with Indigenous people. My fear is that those inadequacies and inefficiencies, dysfunctions of the federal government, the promises become very hard to believe. So in this One Canada goals, they're saying a commitment to Indigenous people, but that's negating what our inherent rights and mission is: to come back into ourselves, to come back into balance and back into community. Without listening to our leadership of how that could look, there's little hope in big projects like this to actually serve community. And I'll stop there. I could keep going, but I look forward to hearing from my other panelists as well.
Thank you for that, Jocelyn. We're just kind of taking some notes while you were speaking, and definitely agree on that. It's hard to believe promises. And I think as part of these major projects, there was an announcement of an Indigenous Advisory Council. And so you can see that there's lip service paid, but not following through and actually upholding our rights. So thank you for that. And Taylor, if you're ready, we can hand off to you.
Hey, thanks. Thank you so much. I needed a minute here. I've been pulled in a million different directions today, and so I just needed to read the question. But it's really interesting, and I'll because I've been thinking about this a lot, and I speak very bluntly and very truthfully, as the Seven Teachings tells us to here back home. For me, these colonial policies and practices such as Bill C-5, it's just another step on the assimilation ladder for myself. And and you know, it's presented very successfully, right? And so I like to challenge our own leaders and our own leadership, because they're also considering a lot of these things, right? Without any communication or any consultation with our community members. You know, even here in my own community, we don't have community engagements. We don't get a say. We don't get a vote. We're all descendants of somebody's signature. So we should all actually have some type of a voice in all of these decisions. And even an Indigenous Advisory Committee, there's not even a representative from Manitoba on that committee, which is even worse. I don't think they'd want me, but I'm sure somebody would be a good fit, right? But you can feel, ever since the announcement of Bill C-5, you can feel the shift happening within our own communities as well as outside of our communities. You can see the tactics that they're taking. And you know, they dress it up very, very nicely in the form of economic reconciliation. My God, if I have to hear that term one more time, I'm gonna go bananas. What I would love to see is, why can't we see terms like environmental reconciliation, food reconciliation, ceremony reconciliation? Where is all of that being presented to us? Right? We're being asked to give up the very things that are our family members: the land, the water, the animals, the trees, the plants, the medicines, the ceremonies. That's the problem, right? Is the Western politics, they don't see the relatives of the land. They just see resources and profits. And that's why they want us to be a part of that system, and we are slowly detaching from those very old teachings. And so it's people like myself and my fellow panelists, we're the ones who are maintaining and continuously fighting for those very things that keep us alive, right? Like the water and all these beautiful things. Why are we not investing in the future of the land, of Mother Earth? Invest in her future, not our own future. It's very selfish what we're doing right now. It's very narcissistic of the two-leggeds, of the way that we're acting with things like Bill C-5. And like Jocelyn, I'll stop there. Miigwech.
Thank you for keeping it real. I'm just nodding my head with everything that you said, and that piece on being the two-leggeds is, I was always told that as human beings, the only thing that distinguishes us from our animal relatives is that we have the ability to speak. And with that comes a responsibility to speak up for creation, and use that. So thank you for that. And I will hand over to Disa.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing. I think that like I've always viewed going about real and lasting sustainable change by focusing on policy and mentorship and intertwining those two things, and so giving youth the empowerment and opportunity to learn and be in the spaces instead of always saying like, you know, youth are the future, and then putting them in this gray area when there's no room for them in our own communities or in spaces where their voices matter. And also, like, Canada is a young country. There's furniture and clothing that are older than our country. And so a lot of this happened almost like, you know, yesterday. And then even like as even everything that we've experienced in the scheme of things is a blip, not saying that it doesn't matter, but I'm just saying that in the scope of like, it wasn't that long ago that Canada was formed. And this, I feel like there's always been ways of them overshadowing that this is a partnership and a contract between our communities and them, and this is, and Canada and the US are like the only countries where the Indigenous people to the lands are so displaced. Like if you go to any other country like Japan, you know, there are people, you can tell their people are from there, and you know, everyone else who goes there and is, and you know, transfers citizenship there is part of their culture, but here it's different, we're like, I feel like just recently even finding out what do we even call ourselves? What are we when we've always known who we are, wherever you come from, whether that's Mohawk, Blackfoot, or from Tsuut'ina or like Dakota, wherever you're from, that's who you are. But Canada's lazy and manipulative, and so they grouped us into three options, and now we kind of internalize that unknowingly. We do a lot of that. So when I mentioned unlearning, those are some of the stuff that I hold close to my heart and I advocate for, because language matters. And, in our own cultures, we don't have such ownership type of terms. Our relationship to the environment around us, everything around us has life. Everything teaches us purpose. Everything has a song. And I think that like you were mentioning, Taylor, how and Justin, how we're kind of get stuck in this cycle of like limbo and stuck in policies and the restrictions of what people are allowed to do in their roles, and how disconnected it is from even people that work in the same departments and the same roles even, is that like they're cutting out all of the almost like the paperwork, the blue red tape, whatever it is, and completely cutting out like what actually matters, because whether their projects or policies take years, they always circle back to us. They always come back to us and be like, okay, like, we're dealing with this issue, and we're like, yeah, we know, we tried to tell you. And so um as a young person, we realize that, we understand our environment around us. Just because a community is either like poor or struggling or in development or going through addictions and the lack of infrastructure, that doesn't mean that you're not aware of your surroundings and your environment and aren't wanting to see change and wanting to be a part of that change. It's very difficult when we get stuck in that gray space. And also just being able to be in spaces where there are people who influence decision making and policy. So going to different conferences where everyone knows each other. There's a common theme of everyone else being talking in like this carousel and talking in cycles and circles, not a cycle, circles, because they're very linear. And also within the work that I do, I have the opportunity to meet other researchers. So these are people who have access to multiple streams of funding. And so they've already checked off funding and the tech and the research part, but they're having a common issue between all these hundreds of researchers of touching their projects to ground. And it's because it's very disconnected from community, and the humanity aspect of their work is very put on the shelf. And these are talks that bring life to projects and bring life to what communities need and what is important to us. And so I think that I think they're just trying to bypass a lot of things that they've probably already promised to do. And so this policy kind of like just speeds up the process of them getting to what they need and whatnot. But I hope that all made sense. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I love that point on Canada is a young country. My home community, we have wampum that's older than this country, and we've been Haudenosaunee for far longer than Canada has existed, and we will when they no longer exist. So thank you for that. And I'll hand over again to Willow just to wrap up this part of the discussion.
Sweet, thanks, Carol. Hard to follow these powerhouses on the panel. I'm so excited to be here with everybody today. So this question about colonial policies and legislation like Bill C5, what immediately comes to mind is policing and how policies require policing. whether that's enacted at the local, the national, or the international level. And so back home in British Columbia, we actually have a paramilitary police force. And it was formerly known as the CIRG, the Community Industry Response Group. And they've actually recently done a rebrand to the CRU, the Community Response Unit. And so I think this rebranding is to, absolve themselves of what they've done to Indigenous people protecting their territories. And under a new name that includes the word community, they're trying to paint this picture of purity. And so under things like Bill C5, that fast track these projects of national interest and, or these ponies for short. And so like we've seen in the last few months is, Carbon Cowboy Mark Carney is riding these ponies all over Canada. And half of these ponies are actually taking place in British Columbia alone. And so when we have federal legislation like Bill C5, to protect those projects that are bringing about so much environmental destruction. And, especially when we think about how Mark Carney is currently in Prince Rupert. So my home territories, and even where I'm currently living in Prince George right now, it is actually home to some of the highest rates of missing and murdered Native women in North America. And it is actually called the Highway of Tears. And so it is outrageous that Mark Carney is at the tail end of the Highway of Tears, getting ready to release the next wave of major projects, and so I think about the police and the paramilitary presence that is required to fulfill what these laws seek to accomplish. And this is not something that is unique just to British Columbia. This is also, we see this when, back in 1990 on the siege on Gensitage, when they were met by the Canadian military for resisting, a golf course that was being proposed over an Indian burial ground. We see this when the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxsan nations are resisting Coastal GasLink, and there's snipers all across their territories. And even while I'm here in Belém right now in Brazil at COP30, I see this every single day when I walk into the venue and there's a tank there. And, when there's the Brazilian military walking around with automatic rifles at a climate summit, can someone please make this make sense? And so this is what I think about when I better understand colonial legislation like Bill C5 and the colonial entities like Canada who attempt to redwash these major projects by introducing things like the Indigenous Advisory Council. It doesn't make it okay just because there's some natives that kind of sold out and are participating in the office of these major projects. And so when I think about Bill C5, I think about the heavy military presence that is required to support these projects. Pass back to you, Carol.
Thank you to that, Willow. And again, thank you for making those links between harms on our communities and our people and the harms to the land. And just through kind of what all the panelists have been saying, I'm just thinking of how Bill C5 is this sort of current presentation of this, but we know that this is business as usual in this country. This should not come as a surprise to anybody that Canada is doing this. It should not come as a surprise that there is a paramilitary presence somewhere like Belém. So thank you to Willow for pulling that all together. And speaking of Belém, I'm going to direct my next question to Jocelyn, which is that this is the 30th Conference of the Parties, and by its very nature, institutions like the UNFCCC view climate action in this very mathematical approach, emissions reductions by 30%, 35, 40. And so while we do need fast, fair, and forever reductions to emissions across all sectors, what are the limitations and the downfalls of such an approach?
Goodness Chish, Carol, and goodness Chish, fellow panelists, you guys are amazing. It's really, really incredible to listen to you. Super inspiring. And, this question gets at the heart of one of our Western societies, like fundamental challenges, which is the rise of numeracy and science and fact, and how that drives our decision making and our approach to the climate crisis. And so, in my work with youth and the Reconnection Vision and many others, they say that, solutions come from a worldview, and as does this crisis. And as we seek to make solutions, we have to think beyond what's causing the crisis. What's causing the crisis, we know, is this economically driven drive for extraction to create growth and wealth, economic money-based wealth, which we measure. We measure through numbers. And we like to see numbers get bigger. And that's a lot of what's driving things here. So if the solution is within that same framework, we want to see numbers get smaller, looking at carbon emissions or looking at how many solar panels we have put out. But really, the fundamental challenge for us is actually individualism and our sense of worth and wealth and what is success. If you ask Indigenous youth, what is success? Many of them are not going to say a 9-to-5, 6-figure job and a house. They're going to say that I'm connected to my community, that I know how to, harvest. I know where the fish are doing well or where they're not. And I'm able to pass that knowledge on to the generation coming from beneath me. So when we're focused on something that science tells us is the climate solution, we limit the understanding that what we're actually working towards is a return to community, that the biggest loss that we have as a society is community and the rise of individualism. And we have to think really hard about that when it comes to the environmental movement, to the Indigenous movement, when we start pushing at policies and government trends, because none of them are really focused on what it means to confront capitalism, individualism, consumerism, all the isms. But really what we're needing to come back to is, how do we live together? How do we share? How do we respect each other? And none of those are to be measured because they're all founded in love. Love is not to be measured. Love is to be felt. And as we are coming back into this world that is actually grounded by love and spirit, it is within our hearts and not within our minds that drives how we do things. So we have to come back into our full being, which is a beautiful thing, which is what our culture teaches us to do. And I wonder if those decision makers, if the Indigenous Advisory Committee was able to bring heart into spirit in a really meaningful way. I know they're not going to be able to do this. But if heart and spirit were guiding how decisions were being made under those responsible for Bill C-5, we know that they would make much different decisions, much different investments that would be more about community and future looking. And so that's one of the questions I ask myself often is, how do we push to bring our whole person? And Diza, you said this too, bringing humanity. You said it really beautifully. That humanity is put on the shelf, that it's secondary to what we can measure. And so when we focus on what is measurable, what is documentable, and that's primarily what governments do. They're very good at documenting, very good at reporting, not good at doing. It's up to us as leaders, as Indigenous people to do. And I really think that that's a lot of what we're here today trying to figure out.
Thank you for that, Jocelyn. I feel like I have some goosebumps after that, and resonating with everything that you were saying, especially on that piece of disconnection. And I think, especially in the context of COP30, we could transition entirely to renewable energy, but we don't want business as usual. People can envision a world, entirely run on renewable energy, but not one where Indigenous people rights are recognized, or like a world with Indigenous people leading these things, and that disconnection limits us. So thank you to that for that. And I'm going to pass over next to Taylor. So we've been talking about this push for resource extraction in the name of energy sovereignty. And at an international level, one of the biggest outcomes of COP30 is what's called the proposed BLM action mechanism, or the BAM. We love our acronyms in the climate world, which seeks to advance a global just transition. But one of the things with these with a renewable energy economy is so-called critical minerals. And so can you speak to some of the concerns that Indigenous communities in particular have in regards to mining for critical minerals?
Yeah, this is the first time I've heard of BAM. So I'm not too sure how that's going down there. Maybe Willow could talk about that. But here in Manitoba, sorry, I'm rewriting my notes. In Manitoba, you know, the need or the push for critical minerals is a very much it's becoming a top-down approach, right? Even our biggest Indigenous leader in Manitoba, whose name I don't think I need to say, but you know, most people know who he is at this point, is pushing for critical minerals and calling Manitoba the Costco of critical minerals, right? And oh God, when I first heard that term, I shuddered in my seat a little bit, right? Because a lot of these extractive projects happen within our traditional territories and within very close proximity to Indigenous communities as well. And the issue is that we're continuously pushing forward for new projects and new advancements and new minerals and new this and new that, and we don't even need them, right? Silica sand's a perfect example. I won't get into that too much because I think that's my next question around silica sand extraction here and some of the work we've done in Brokenhead. But nobody needs a new phone every year. How many people on this call have a new iPhone 17? How many people here have a brand new 2025 vehicle? How many people here have an iPad, a MacBook, an iMac? And how many of those things do you actually need? Right? And we're all a part of the system. I'm not saying I'm not any better. I have all those things too, right? But we're a part of this vicious cycle of consumerism where we need to take and take and take and buy. I was reading a statistic not long ago that said youth, the next generation, don't like they'd rather buy new than actually repair anything. And so that's what's being sold to us, right? As what's new, what's hot, what's needed. And so that's a big issue, right? In especially in Manitoba, right? And all of these things happen around Indigenous communities. Our water's at risk, our medicines are at risk, our youth are at risk, our sacred burial grounds are at risk. Manitoba Hydro has already completely flooded and destroyed sacred burial grounds. In the north, you can see actual human remains floating down the river from their burial grounds of babies. I've seen it firsthand. I've worked in northern Manitoba for many, many years. And whether it's critical minerals, whether it's hydro, whether it's pipelines, whether it's agriculture, it doesn't matter. These bring a lot of trouble to our communities. When you start to build and mine and extract, now you need man camps. And what comes with those man camps? Drugs, alcohol, abuse to women, abuse to the people who are there. Our communities up north, we still have boiled water advisories in Manitoba. We have some of the highest suicide rates. We have communities constantly going under emergency states because of the amount of teen suicides. But we need more critical minerals. That's what's really important, right? And so these are the things. Why are we not actually creating resources that actually help recycle the minerals and things and devices that we already have, right? Why are we not looking into that type of stuff, right? Why? And these are the questions that I constantly ask myself is how much more do we have to take? How many more times do we have to rip open Mother Earth and take her blood and take her breath and take her life away from her until we're satisfied? We never seem to be satisfied. And I get very frustrated of talking about these things all the time. I understand the importance of constantly reiterating these messages and sharing these things with people. But as Indigenous land guardians and water protectors and land defenders, when are you going to actually start frickin' listening? Right? When are you going to actually let us do the one thing that we were put on this earth to do, and that's to protect and live in reciprocity with the natural world? But we can't even do that. And it's very difficult. And as somebody who tries to maintain and advocate for those old ways, I always get pushed aside from Indigenous and non-Indigenous people that say things, oh, it'll never be like that again. Well, why can't we at least try? Why can't we bring some of those old teachings into a modern world and show that relationship, that relationality, that's what's needed and what's missing so much? And so in Manitoba, I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous communities in Manitoba, but I can tell you right now that there are some who are for it, and there are some who are against it. And that's another ploy of dividing and conquering us, right? Right? That's a part, that was the whole part of the reserve system anyways, too, right? Is remove us from one another so we're not strong as we could be as together. And so when I think about leadership and looking at a positive, sustainable future for our youth, I'd love to see a world where those reserve systems, those boundaries are depleted, where we can actually advocate for one another for the bigger picture, where it's not like, oh, you're not a band member, don't talk for us, or you don't live here, so you can't speak for us. Why do we need permission to advocate for the land and for the water? I'll stop there. Miigwech.
Thank you for that, Taylor. I feel like you hit on so many incredible things on that divisiveness, even in our own communities. And what you
Yes,
said
I'm
earlier
sorry.
with the
I'm sorry,
the
that sounds so
Costco of
stern.
critical minerals. Loved it. But even just that concept of the Costco of critical minerals, right? Like this looking at the earth as not our relative and as our mother, but as something to make money from, really being the heart of that problem. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to direct my next question to Disa. So you mentioned some of your work with the Blackfoot Youth Water Council, your work as a community researcher. And so why is it so important for Indigenous people, and in particular our young people, to be involved in and aware and fully empowered in policymaking decisions?
Thank you. Just really quickly, I wanted to mention that, like, it's important to hold space for our frustrations in these conversations. They're not coming from thin air. And we're also, it's not when someone's getting passionate like that and speaking about stuff that matters to them and that affects them, I never see them as just this angry and disruptive person, even though you feel like a broken record. I think it's also just important to remember that we're not angry people, we're not hateful people. Um, that anger and frustration comes from wanting peace and love, and it comes from a place of love and a good place where you want a better quality of life for you and your community and people. And I think it's important to bring that energy into these spaces and hold space for everyone who isn't in this space as well. So the people that we've lost, whoever has experienced loss recently or over the course of their life. And so those are important things to just highlight. And my prayers and my thoughts and my love go out to everyone experiencing what they're experiencing. And it is a very depressing space to be in, especially the more you learn about one issue in our communities. We all can relate to issues going on in other communities. They might be different situations and scenarios, but they affect us the same way. We have different practices and cultures, but when we are like side by side, we have a lot in common and we have a lot of practices that are similar. And so that is unfortunately we share the same kind of pain. And that's woven in our DNA at this point because of the things that we've gone through and our family has gone through, and our mothers and our grandmothers. And so it's important to just bring those types of conversations into these spaces and for whatever anyone else is going through as well. Um, for me, also just really wanted to mention quickly was that I have a similar story to Willow when you said how like Kearney is like in your homeland. About like maybe a year or two ago, I went to Ottawa for a gathering, and Justin Trudeau came to my res. So I got out just in time. And yeah, so it's the same story, but that's a story for another day, another webinar. um and I think that it's important to have Indigenous people at these conversations and in policy making, and just at the table, because Indigenous communities are the first to feel the effects of climate change and of the fallout from these policies, and the backlash and just like everything that the shortcomings of all these policies and these problems. We're the very first community that feels the that will feel and experience the shortage of water, of food, of power, of all these basic necessities. We're also significantly underfunded and understaffed. So things that happen in like communities like, just like major cities or just bigger communities, problems that affect them will get fixed in like the same week and mostly the same day. But those types of problems, when they happen in Indigenous communities, will take months to fix, um, and so that's just a smaller scale of how these policies can affect and have lasting effects on our communities. Um, and Water is super powerful. It's something that I've always focused on. My grandma mentions how when fire scorches the land, it leaves things behind, or some stuff that are left over. But when a flood happens, almost everything gets washed away. Um, and I wanted to share quick little situation or event, not situation, sorry, event that happened to my community, and it directly relates to a lack of consideration in policy and having Indigenous communities and young people at the table and in conversation, which was a major flood that affected Siksika in 2013. So we are very close to the mountains. We are also mountain people. We're very nomadic, and we migrated with the buffalo. Um, so we have connection to the river that runs from the mountains to our community. And we've been here for centuries. And so what happens during snow melt seasons is that there's the runoff where it takes a couple months, and then it comes down and the river gets a little bit higher. The land that is close to the water will be a little bit more unstable and is prone to like breaking off. But what happened is that in 2013, there was between 24 to 48 hours of major rain. So it kind of sped up the process of like the snowfall in the area. And what happened was that the dams along the way, their gates were bursting, but also the way that they're set up is that they mainly benefit the surrounding communities, and other resources. They're not really in consideration of who is downstream and how it affects our way of life and our access to water. And they just don't have like the same consideration. It's very, by the time the water gets to my community, it's like not the same color. It's been through the ringer. It's like it's also very unnatural to this day. The river isn't the same the way it used to be. I know not a lot of things are different and affected, but it's very unnatural. And my dad references these things that are basically like water chutes, so that they're put in place so that communities upstream don't have their communities be like flooded out. It just like streams the water out of their communities back into the water. But what all those systems put in place was that like when the flood happened, instead of having their communities affected and the dams upstreams affected and their gates bursting and overflowing, they chose each to let go of the water, and they chose willingly to flood my community. And so hundreds of people's homes were destroyed. Like they were lifted from the ground and shifted, and some homes were lifted into the river, and like they were smashing against the bridges along a river. And even the houses that weren't flooded and affected, our surrounding communities, our water was black. When we couldn't drink it, we couldn't cook with it, we couldn't bathe in it. And just the last couple of years too, my community members have just finally moved into permanent housing, and that happened in 2013. And so, you know, that's the fallout of not having Indigenous communities brought into the conversation of, well, how do this policy, how would this infrastructure and piece of technology fit into community? And a process that I believe in and that I've adopted from an organization called COST that I've worked with in the past, that has really kind of like spoke to me, but also it just highlights like what a lot of Indigenous people have already been practicing, but they just kind of broke it down into like a catchy phrase, which is the 3 E's, which are to educate, engage, and empower. So instead of just being like, okay, like, you know, I have this biosound filter, or I have this, you know, whatever piece of technology here, like give it to this community and be done with it and act like, you know, saviors, but instead that it's a process where they get to know the community, and educate. You know, there's an exchange of knowledge and a building of relationship and um, sustainable resources between the two. Um, and so that's a process that I bring into the work that I do, and other, when just involving everyone, because you learn from communities you go to. You get more than you know, you get more out of that interaction. So that's like the education part. The engagement part is being a part of these policies, these projects, this technology that you're introducing to communities, and having them completely run by the community. And sometimes, you know, like it's not just all about like I'm just referencing a technology being brought into the community. I'm not saying that's what I'm encouraging. Just using it as an example. And you learn that, like, you know, there's already systems and century-long traditions and practices that are there for a reason, that if you had just listened to the people and to the land, you would know what is needed. And then, so the Black Youth Water Council last year got certified in a training called Cabin. Um, and so what that is being able to test our water, and also being able to, we have the certification to enter that into the National Canadian Database. So we'll be able to not only do testings in Siksika, but be able to test, you know, in other communities or just further upstream or downstream, and really just be able to have that knowledge and have access to the University of Calgary's existing studies and research projects, and maps and stuff. And yeah, so I think that, like, you know, those are the benefits of having Indigenous young people there, is that they're capable and that we're allowed to learn as we go. And everyone's voice matters, and you don't have to be one type of way to exist in these spaces. And that was what I also did with 7 Gen. So maybe I can like leave the 7 Gen word for the next question, but those were just a little bit of an example, but about my community and perspective regarding having Indigenous people and young people at the policy change making tables.
Thank you for that, Lisa, and thank you for sharing your community story. And I think what you shared highlights this concept of our communities being sacrifice zones. So it doesn't matter what happens to them if, in the name of industry, in the name of extraction, in the name of energy sovereignty and nation building projects. And I also really appreciated what you said in the beginning about the role of emotions in this. And I think it's something that I myself get emotional sometimes about I don't say sometimes, pretty much every day I get upset or angry about this crisis that we're in. And so for people, you know, whatever you're feeling about this, anger, grief, anxiety, you know, I think that's human and that's normal. And emotions are our biggest teacher, and it says something about the path that we're on. So thank you, Disa, for your sharings. And I'm going to pass over to Willow, just to share a little bit more about being at COP. You've been there for about a week now, both attending since Monday in preparatory meetings for the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. And so what are your initial impressions so far? And in particular, how is the removal of the US being perceived by people?
Yeah, thank you. I can actually just kind of acknowledge the first bit of that US question, and then I'll talk a bit more about some reflections that I've had in the last few days. I think with the US withdrawing from some of these bigger agreements at COP30, such as, the Paris Agreement, which has just entered into its 10th year, and so it's a big check-in year. And it's not the first time the US has left. Donald Trump actually left it in his first presidency. But I don't really want to talk about that Cheeto administration right now, and so I'll actually share some of these other reflections that I've had. What I've been thinking about in the last few days and this week that I've been here is that, like how many decisions have been made about my lands and territories, Indigenous territories across the globe, without any of us anywhere in sight, and with COP30 being such an inaccessible space, it's incredibly expensive. You can also only attend if you are affiliated with an organization that is accredited under the United Nations. And so what we're seeing is that Indigenous sovereignty is once again boiled down to a theoretical concept. It is boiled down to a PowerPoint that gets debated where states, colonial states like Canada, wage war on commas and connotations so they don't implicate themselves in crimes against humanity. What I know after, it officially started on Monday, so this is day 4, is that this is not designed for Native people. This is not designed for people in relationship to their territories. And we really saw this a few days ago when a lot of our brothers and sisters, as I'm sure a lot of you saw on social media, some of our brothers and sisters from South America actually stormed the COP venue and broke in because it's not accessible, and what we're seeing in this pushback against that is that they're framing it as violence, as disruptive, but it is violent for Indigenous people to not have access to funds and resources and conventions on their own territories, where decisions are happening about their lands, their waters, and their future generations. That is violent. It is violent that I, as a Native person, have to intervene at the UN in this English language, this colonial tongue, when my own dialect is facing a language extinction back home. This is violence. And the value in attending this as a Native person is that we have to disrupt these narratives that uphold colonial violence over Indigenous lands and bodies. Like as Indigenous people, we are all too familiar with the weaponization of language. We know that words build worlds, and we must move away from language that holds us captive in colonial mindsets and frameworks of engaging with the world. As Indigenous people, it is also not our responsibility to shape and change these systems that have brought so much harm. It is our responsibility to build new worlds. I firmly believe that every single person here in this webinar, at this COP venue, everybody back home, that we all have an individual creative contribution toward collective well-being. And we cannot keep shifting this responsibility and accountability to this idea of tomorrow. We are here now. And despite all of these efforts to exterminate us, we are still here and we are not leaving. And, we may not know what the future will look like, but we will know how it feels. It will feel like joy and creativity and rest, and I know for a fact that a sovereign Indigenous future will not seek the recognition of states or institutions. And on this kind of note about language, to not maybe incriminate myself, I did come face to face with a Canadian negotiator today in a sharing circle for Indigenous knowledge holders. And we were talking about this term called nationally determined contributions. And we don't have to get into the thick of things because it's kind of boring. It's pretty dry. And so we won't have to go into that. But what this negotiator was talking about, and not to, name them directly, but let's just say that their name rhymes with Schmetra, if you want to look at the Canadian delegation that's at COP30 this year. And this person was talking about nationally determined contributions and working directly with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And I heard this and I didn't even know that they were in the room. And I immediately put my hand up to make an intervention because, as I was saying, we need to disrupt these narratives that uphold this colonial violence. And so what I shared on the floor was just that, this person does not speak for me as a First Nations person. Especially when their prime minister is currently a few hours north of my territories right now, announcing this next wave of major projects that will bring about Indigenous rights violations, that will bring about even more environmental destruction in places and territories that have already been decimated by forest fires in recent years, being totally impacted by this epidemic of missing and murdered Native women and this epidemic of opioid overdoses, and so we need to tell the truth about Canada because it is often touted as this state that has, a good relationship to the climate and climate action, or it's seen as a positive thing in its relationship to Indigenous people. But as an Indigenous person, we know that that is not true. And so this is the value in attending spaces like this, where we get to disrupt this messaging, where we get to meet other Indigenous people doing really incredible work in their territories, And so I confronted this person at the end and I was like, with any of these climate commitments that Canada is talking about on this global stage at COP30 in Belém, how is any of that possible under Bill C5? And I was met with quite a politician response, and which is, classic. And so, yeah, we need to continue taking up space, we need to reclaim the present moment. And like Disa was saying, like this is not about tomorrow and the future. This is right now. And so if there's any Indigenous youth on this webinar right now, remember who you are and where you came from, because it is only then that you will know where you can go. Pass back to Carol.
Thank you to that, Willow. Again, I'm all fired up listening to that. And I think there were so many important things in there. And something that I was even thinking of with some of Lisa's sharings is youth aren't just the future, they're the present, but also we have a responsibility to not continue business as usual. And we know that young people will face a bigger burden of climate chaos, and we can't allow this burden to be laid on them, and we all have to be playing a role, and whatever that looks like, whether that's at home on a grassroots level, whether it's at that high level, in spaces like the COP, our people need to be pushing forward our rights and sharing our knowledge as not just a box to tick or some kind of consultation but actually as the real path forward beyond just these climate commitments and these real mathematical approaches down to the last gigaton of carbon dioxide of real meaningful change. So thank you, Willow. And so we're coming to the end of our time, not quite, but we're going to move. The next phase of questions is more about future facing. And so I'm going to direct this to Taylor. And so we can unfortunately expect a ramp up of proposed mining projects. And you discussed a little bit about your home community, Broken Head Ojibwe Nation, rejecting a partnership with a silica sign mining company. Is there anything that you would like to share about that? And what would you like other communities to know about this process?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and go pretty quick so everybody has a chance to speak before we're done. But yeah, so CO silica or Silica, whatever you want to call them. CO silica here in southern Manitoba, they've been trying to get a silica sand extraction mine going here in southern Manitoba, Vivian, Manitoba, actually. Broken Head is the closest nation to where they're hoping to extract the silica sand. And so they were denied their first environmental license, and then they started going to First Nations to try to get a partner. And so Broken Head leadership were the first ones to fancy that idea. And so CO Silica started about a year ago doing what they call quote unquote consultation engagement sessions, which were complete baloney. And so one of the ways that they approached it was they divided our community, right? And so you had to register, you had to apply online to attend these consultations. So right there, you've removed youth and elders. And then they divided us into 3 separate groups. So we couldn't actually come together and speak about this. And it was funny because CO Silica, they, at these initial meetings, they kept talking about reconciliation this and reconciliation that. And I looked directly at their eyes, and they already knew who I was when I went into that meeting. Funny enough, every meeting I had a nice big old target on my back, which that's okay. But they kept talking about reconciliation. And so I looked that guy, the owner, right in the eyes, and I said, you keep talking about reconciliation. Which one of those 94 calls to action of reconciliation exactly are you actually going to help or work towards? And it was just dead silence, eh? They had no idea what to answer. It's like, oh, I don't know. I was like, well, let's stop talking about that. Like, move on. Right. And then the following meeting, there was a big sign outside the meeting room that said call to action number 92 or something like that. I'm like, oh my God. Anyways, so at all of these different meetings I went to, they would ask me questions like, "Oh, where did you get your education? Who do you think you are? You don't know anything." They accused me of getting an online degree from a Chinese university. Oh, the works. They called me out in every way you could possibly imagine. And I just sat there, um, just being resilient, right, as we normally do. But as time progressed, I ended up hosting like my own community meeting at the Powwow Arbor here in Broken Head, and we discussed these things and the lack of communication that we had from our leadership. So our own leadership never attended a single meeting. They never answered our questions. They never were available to the community. We couldn't address this outside of those consultations. It was a very weird situation. And very disrespectful towards their people that they lead. And so we put on our own community meeting, and then I went away to the Seal River watershed for their land summit at the end of July. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Chief and Council released a letter saying they were doing a referendum to vote on CO Silica, and they gave us 24 hours. And they were hosting the vote during Treaty Days, which is a time of celebration and when people are out on the land here in Broken Head. And so it was very strategically planned in that way. And so I was landlocked. I was trapped. I shouldn't say trapped. I was stuck up north because of wildfires. And so I felt very helpless. And so what I did was I wrote a letter to Chief and Council, and I told them, like, you can't do this. You can't provide us with less than 24 hours. You can't have a vote during treaty days. You can't allow, it was very also one-sided information that they were providing to the community. It was all just CO Silica's information. It was all of their pamphlets, all of their, their business cards, all of these, their greenwashing brochures that they had, but they never included any of the information that we, the community, provided. As an environmental scientist, I had all that background knowledge. We hosted those meetings to educate the community on the other side of Seal Silica, but they never included any of our information in those information packages. And so I wrote them a letter and I told them, if you don't respond to us within 48 hours, I have no choice but to host a public protest right outside of our community, right outside where that vote is going to take place. And I never got a response. And so I went ahead with it, and we had about 80 people show up. And then all the news outlets here in Manitoba, from CBC to APTN, all of them showed up. And we advocated for the water. It was funny that day that we had that protest. Don't mind my dog in the background. She's having a good old time. But it was like spirit had hurt us that day. I woke up, it was a Friday, August 8th, and had everything prepared for this protest, and it just poured. Thunderbirds and everything, lightning, thunder, pouring rain the day of this protest. And it was a gift, honestly, because what happens with the CO Silica mine is they wanted to drill 7,500 wells in the ground and completely destroy our groundwater and drinking water, some of the best in southern Manitoba. And it just poured here. and poured and poured and poured all day until the end of the protest, and the sun came out. And it was as if Mother Earth had heard our calls and heard our prayers and cried for us, and we cried with her at the same time. And later that day, when you went in to go and vote, the silica sand mine vote was right tucked in a tiny little corner of the band hall, amidst all the treaty settlements they were announcing and hydro settlement money and all these things. It was very, very shady. But we went and we fought as hard as we could. And I didn't do it by myself. It was myself and other women of the community, and even women outside of the community from non-Indigenous communities as well. And we ended up winning the vote, which was amazing. But they're back, right? They just submitted their new environmental application and they promised less wells, and, they're gonna clean the water, and it's all very unproven science, and it's all a very unproven way of extracting silica sand. It's brand new. And so I'll see what happens in the future, but you best believe we're not done and we'll never be done. And it's exhausting work doing environmental advocacy and guardianship work, but it's so much needed. And I will stretch myself in a million different ways and take a piece of my spirit here and a piece of my physical body there, so the youth can see a positive mentor that'll constantly advocate for their future, a future where they need clean water to survive. And I don't care if they target me 60 times and call me every name in the book, or blacklist me from public events. I won't stop fighting. And I was a gift that Creator gave me was a voice, and I just needed to find the right spaces for it. And here we are. And I hope that, if you want to get into advocacy work, you got to be prepared to kind of get a little bit crushed from time to time by your own people as well. But understand that when you follow those teachings, those original instructions, those 7 sacred teachings, and you keep ceremony in your heart and smoke your pipe and smudge every morning and pray for the land and for the water, they'll help you heal as well. Chimiwach. I'm sorry, that took a little bit longer. I said I wasn't going to take that long.
No need to say sorry. And thank you for all of that. And I was really personally inspired by your community story and what you shared. And that is something that people should be aware of as an option and raising that awareness. So thank you. I'm going to direct my next question to Disa. Based off of what you shared, your work with the Blackfoot Youth Water Council, and you mentioned 7Gen, what sort of policy changes should we really be pushing for, and how can more people get involved? I think especially for Indigenous people, we tend to be real humble and sometimes hold ourselves back from things. And so what would you say to people to get them involved?
So when so my father was the former research coordinator for a department called Land Claims. And so a lot of his work was researching lands and our treaty rights, and how that affects like our community and us as just stewards of the land. And also just attending conferences with him, kind of growing up in that space. And then when I finally started going to like having the opportunity to go to like conferences with like Suncor at a young age, and just different events, energy gatherings and water gatherings, I was so I was very discouraged, but and also like, you always grow up in 2 different worlds when you're living on reserve and going out into the world. There's so many questions that you answer differently, but also you have like also 2 different truths, and you're walking in these 2 different worlds, and and um it was super discouraging at the time because just like a lot of things, there was no right space for us and involvement. Like, the questions that are being asked, there's just so much differences, and there's so much lack of humanity in those spaces, and like anyone that has been in there, you realize sometimes it's like, well, you're not really meant to be in those spaces, or you're not, you feel very like, how's your voice going to matter in those conversations when with all these like politicians, business people, investors, and everyone who influences decision making in our provinces and in our country. And it's very exclusive and extractive. And I remember um, I remember going to a conference in Winnipeg, and I was a part of a youth delegation with Student Energy. And this was just right before getting started on working on 7 Gen. Um, I remember like just like being so uncomfortable in the room and just being angry, like being so disgusted with like just the questions being asked, like how, like just like not just from that gathering, but just from gatherings that I've been to where I've been asked, like, it's not like the native people want, it's not like the natives want the land back. It's not like just different like really gross questions of like, is there even Indigenous people in Canada or in the States, just like very, very uneducated questions, and coming to face with those, like, that even communities that are 20 minutes away from our communities know nothing about our communities. And some of that is racism, and is like willing ignorance, but a lot of that is also just they don't know because of how young our country is, and because they really just don't have access to um, knowledge, the knowledge that, because just everything that we've gone through. Um, and so I remember going back to my hotel room before I had to go back to the gathering. And I was like, oh, I don't even want to be here anymore. Like, I'm just like, this is so like, the space is just not Indigenous friendly. It's not inclusive. It's not like there's no life in there. I'm talking to these people who have so much access to technology and power, and like I don't see any life in their eyes. And I remember like I was like 18 or 19, and I remember just being like, you know what, like I've already accepted and gone over the situation in my head, and I know the energy in that room, and I've observed what I've observed. So I have nothing to lose. I'm just gonna go in there and then just start being a Blackfoot woman. I'm just gonna start being loud and proud, and um, ask questions, and just start not catering and coddling to them, and answering questions like, okay, they expect me to be a part of the dominant society, so I'm gonna answer in that way. And I started answering truthfully, like, we don't say, who are you and what do you do? That title means nothing to us. You're not better than me because you have a title. I'm not better than you because I have a title. Um, when we gather, we say, who are you and where do you come from? Who are you and who are your parents? Because human connection is much more important, and the sense of community is important, and it's the root of success in our projects and in our families and in our communities. Our sense of gathering together when we're hurting or when we're celebrating is huge. And I remember even going to different gatherings in different countries, and there's a bunch of natives there, and we all meet up, and that's like the first time we meet up together. But other people comment and be like, and they're like, um, how long have you guys known each other? And we're like, we just met, but as Indigenous people, we have a common understanding of how we treat each other and how we have that relationship with each other. And so that was something that I took into consideration when starting 7 Gen. I was like, there's no space for Indigenous people, so I'm going to make the space. I'm going to demand it, and I'm going to work around these systems. And so I was able to get mentorship from Student Energy and a few other really powerful women, and that really took care of me and guided me. And I was just like, I went in with the same mindset of like going in there with good intentions and positive heart, um, and then the love for my people and my community. And I just wanted to celebrate our stories and gather together and put together a gathering that is the opposite of everything that is lacking in these other conferences and these other gatherings. And so that's how 7 Gen was born. But it was also not built in ownership of mine. I don't think of it as, okay, that's my property. 7 Gen is its own being. You know, we have a relationship to it. Everyone can contribute and attend 7 Gen, and if it ever is feeling like 7 Gen is going in a different direction, then that's not 7 Gen, you know, because it's meant to gather all of us and celebrate our voices and our stories, and that goes a long ways. So bringing that up, I've been able to also just attend so many other gatherings and projects across the country and in other countries, and I've come across people who have attended and just like or been around those spaces, and something I'm super proud of is that they were on the brink of walking away from the energy sector, walking away from, you know, climate change and just all these conversations because there was no space for them. But they attended 7 Gen, and it brought them back into the conversation, and you know, like, even though the labor isn't ours to take on, we're able to do work on our terms and in our own ways, and share what we want to and not overshare, and, you know, just and find our own balance, whatever that looks like to us, because, you know, they don't need to know everything. So and there's, like, you know, just following our own protocols. And so I spoke about these same projects and values at the World Water Week last year, and where I opened World Water Week. And then I've also spoken on a panel with other Indigenous delegates, and we came from different places. And like I mentioned before, we were kind of dealing with the same types of issues. And then not long after World Water Week, about a week later, I traveled to Brazil, and I attended the International Meeting of Territories and Knowledge. And that was about like 4 hours away from Sao Paulo in the region of Rio. And it was very decentralized, and so there was not too many English speakers. But I wasn't afraid. I was, you know, I was very like mindful of the space I was in, and very thankful to be there and learn from them. But when I say I wasn't worried, it's because, you know, their artwork and how they treat each other, and they're similar to, you know, my community, and they're similar to the communities that I visited across Canada and the States. And, you know, we're faced with things like when the I was in usually has 80% humidity, but when I was visiting, it was like 30 or just under 30%. So, you know, just the things that they're dealing with because they're not being considered um, are similar, like what we're going through, and it's super important to a positive like consult. When we talk about reconciliation and how language matters, is that, you know, I never understood why reconciliation was the chosen word for whatever it's right now, because that always meant to me that like we had a good relationship at one point, but that never happened. You know, they've been um they've been harmful and extractive and exploitive for since, you know, the creation of Canada, what is known as Canada. And so, you know, I do think that instead of that, you know, different language and a language that means something to us can be introduced. And I always think of it in a different way, because, you know, we're kind of like, they, you know, when something is being unjust to Indigenous communities, they blame us and also put it on us to fix, like it's our fault, but it isn't. And I want to just finish with saying that I'm super proud of everyone for being here and sharing space with me, and I'm super proud of all the panelists, and my heart is really happy hearing about the work that you all do, and the way you're making positive change and putting good out in the world. And I'm super proud of all of you.
Thank you for that, Disa, and all of your sharings, just really making me think about all of this. And even so, just we're technically over time now. So for people who are watching, if you do have to hop off, that's okay. This will be recorded. And we do have our lovely interpreters for about 10 more minutes. So I'm trying to pivot a little bit. we have two more questions for Jocelyn and Willow, but we're also going to do closing remarks. But Taylor does have to leave. So Taylor, I'm wondering if you'd like to just make any closing remarks, and then we'll ask our questions to Jocelyn and Willow, and then closing remarks from the three of you. Is that all right with you, Taylor?
All right. Yeah, so thank you so much, Chimi Gwech. It was really awesome discussion and hearing everybody, and lots to think about, lots to work towards and fight for and advocate for, and yeah, we'll we'll wait and see how things unfold, and hopefully we can all meet in person one day and do this work together. That's all. Chimigwech to Indigenous Climate Action for the invite and for hosting this amazing panel with all these deadly water and land warriors here and defenders. And I hope we can all, continue this discussion in other ways back home in our own home territories as well. Magwech.
Thank you, Taylor. And thank you, everybody. And so for our last 10 minutes, I'm going to direct to Jocelyn. And you mentioned your work with Reconnection Vision. And so we've talked about this situation that we're in, but to sort of maybe end on a little bit of a higher note, what are potential pathways for real solutions that can uphold Indigenous rights?
Goodness, Tish, and I'll keep it very short. This is a wonderful panel. Again, I just am so inspired. Essentially, what we're trying to do is wean ourselves off consumer capitalism and create a new sense of dependency and security back into community. And, there's going to be jars to that, and there could also be intention to that. And I think that as Indigenous people, that's what we're trying to do. That's what we are doing. And as with any moment of change, there does need to be grief. Because if that's what we're doing, then are we fighting government anymore? Are we pushing on policy and expectations of the government to make change? Like, where does our energy best go? And the Reconnection Vision, has 10 seeds of change. And the first two are, first, we must heal. And then we need to relearn how to work together, how to be together, how to navigate through conflict. And healing requires grief. We can grieve. And my friend Severin Suzuki Cullis, who I work with at the David Suzuki Foundation, did a really great interview that's up on DSF yesterday about COP. And in there, she talked a lot about grief and how we need to grieve this environmental movement that has failed. And we need to, as we grieve, we rethink what it is that we're actually doing and how we're trying to drive change. And, I think that's really important. I really believe that's a big part of the work. It's coming back into being human. But yeah, I'll just keep it with that. Goodness, Chish.
Thank you for that, Jocelyn. And again, I think that grieving is a part of it. I think especially as I'm technically agent of the youth category, but still consider myself a youth, is this idea of this future that I feel like I was promised and one that my ancestors fought so hard for no longer exists. And it is really disheartening. And there's also still so much care and fight in me personally. And this is something that we are in for the long haul. So thank you for sharing. And so I'll pass off to Willow. I know it's still early days at COP, but what are some ways that we can continue building momentum? We know that the COP is one space, but how do we keep building this momentum against extractive industries and colonialism?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Carol. I think while there may be a lot of ancestral pain in recent lifetimes, there's equal amounts, if not more, ancestral power that we get to derive our futures from. We need to kill Bill C-5. We need to develop our own community safeguards that do not rely on the police or paramilitary police forces to keep us safe. We keep ourselves safe. As Indigenous people, we know that the power will always be with the people. If colonial states are going hard on propaganda and misinformation, we need to go harder. You know, we must show solidarity with our Black relatives, with our Palestinian relatives, because our liberation is bound with them. You know, we need our creatives and our visionaries to be involved in these movements because we must be able to dream of lives outside of colonialism and capitalism. You know, spend time on your land, learn your language, take care of land defenders so they do not fall through the cracks of colonialism. You know, provide opportunities and tangible benefits to Indigenous youth so that they stay home in their communities and learn from their own culture. You know, I'm really grateful for this dialogue today. It's conversations like this and people like this who make it all worth it, because spaces like the UN rely on spiritual warfare. And it's spaces like this that we created in this webinar today that give us the strength to keep ruminating and resisting. I'm not here to legitimize institutions like the United Nations, but I hope that our presence here on this panel reminds people that decisions about our lands, our waters, and future generations cannot be made without centering self-determination, Indigenous sovereignty, and Native science. You know, there is no just future or climate action without us, and that will only happen if we get our land back.
What else to add to that? Thank you, Willow. And so for the last 5 minutes or so that we have our interpreters, I'm just going to ask our panelists for last closing remarks that you have, any last thoughts, or any projects that you have that you'd like to amplify. I'll start with Lisa.
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to just have these conversations. They're super valuable to me. Thank you everyone for joining and listening and commenting, and also for me to just be able to learn from everyone else. I'm super thankful for everyone's existence and everyone and doing the work that you're doing. I hope that we can cross paths soon and work together, and no one is ever alone, you know, as much as we feel very frustrated and disconnected. We have always been here and we will always be here. We are tied to the, you know, and rooted into the earth, and as we have a relationship with Mother Earth and vice versa. You know, I believe in our stories. I believe in every single one of our communities, and what we are capable of, and how wildly capable we are, and you know, the beauty in our cultures, and in who we are and what we breathe life into. And I hope that whatever you are dealing with in your own communities, that you also rest and you take care of your bodies, your minds, your spirits, and your souls. And that you are allowed to learn and go, you know, you're not subjected and restricted to whatever title you're working with right now. You know, you're allowed to ask questions, you're allowed to think differently and unlearn all these things that we've been subjected to and unintentionally thinking in our communities that limit us and our growth. And decolonization is for anyone, even if you're not from an Indigenous communities. And being able to just, like, you know, support each other is super important, and mobilize together, and you know, just form legal teams, and just like being able to do that work together is super, super important, like Willow said, because you know, they're worried for all of us gathering. They're worried for us asking these questions, because regardless of what policies they have in place right now, what permits they have, what, you know, water permits they have, because there's no more water permits for Alberta anyways, but even the earliest water permit, our our treaties, our ties to the land, like go before that, you know, before all of that happens. So whatever policies they put in place, we have the rights and the inherent rights to the land that proceeds, you know, everything that is put in place today. So your voice matters, you matter. They will never be able to silence your light and diminish your light, and I support you and everything that everyone is doing. I'm super excited for our future. I know that we have a lot of roadblocks to get over, but I like speaking and ending things with positivity and with like speaking life into things. And as a young person, that's the one thing that is like my pet peeve in conversations, or just like meetings. where we talk in circles and we don't talk about solutions. And we get stuck into a problem because we want it to be perfect. We want it to be better, but it can always get better, and we're not going to learn unless we actually try, and so whatever project you're working on, just go for it. You're allowed to do it and you're allowed to learn as you go, like I've mentioned before. So thank you so much for allowing me to be in a space with all of you. I hope that you all are staying safe. And thank you for having me. And yeah.
Thank you, Disa. And I will just pass over to Jocelyn. If our interpreters have to hop off, totally understandable, but Jocelyn.
Yes, Guinness Chish. Thank you, Disa, Willow, and to Taylor. This was a really great panel, and it was fun for me because I'm used to more government academic space sometimes. So I really enjoy, as always, being with the young people and hearing your passion and your vision for what can be. And that's the hope that we have. So, Guinness Chish.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And last but not least, Willow, to bring it all home, closing remarks.
I wanted to comment on just the structure of the webinar, and I'm actually really grateful that I was able to respond last to these questions, because as we know, Indigenous women are always leading the way. Every single one of us owes our life to an Indigenous woman. And if you're not Indigenous yourself, you owe everything you are to Mother Earth. And so thank you to Disa and Taylor and Jocelyn and Carol for sharing your brilliance and your beauty, and for all of these really incredible reminders about why we do this work and why we occupy spaces like this. And I think my final note will just be to keep an eye out today for the announcement about the major projects happening in Prince Rupert, BC, and that we need to do everything we can to kill Bill C5. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Willow, and thank you again to our panelists, our interpreters at Communities in Color Operate in Allyship. Our comms team shared our website to stay connected with ICA. And thank you for those who stuck around after time. Again, this clearly was a conversation that was much needed. And thank you to everybody. Take care.